Hello YouTube, this is Ryan with Enclosures, back with part 2 of background making. This is where I start covering the foam with putty. So I didn't show in the last video, but I use spray foam to fill in some of the areas. It's just easier in some spots and quicker. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the Polygem 304, 307 Flex putty. It's a two-part putty epoxy that you mix up. And it goes on a lot like clay. I use water. I dip my fingers in it. I've got other tutorials on how to actually do this in more depth, but I use water so my hands don't stick to the putty. And it's what it is. It's real simple. You're just kind of filling in the areas and smoothing it and pushing it into different areas. You can shape it. A lot of times I'll make a little snake, I guess, and try and work my way through an area. I use it to fill in cracks. I use this on the parts where a brush on epoxy won't work as well. It works really well for making the rock textures and that. The brush on is just a lot faster to cover a bigger area. So for time wise, the putty always looks way cooler. I like to do all putty, but it's really time consuming, so I do a mixture of both. So this one here, since it has a water dish in it, I'm using putty completely around it. And then once I seal it with the 1618 clear from Polygem, since it'll be underwater, that'll double seal the epoxy, but the epoxy in itself is essentially a sealer. So one thing I do when I start out, I usually go, you can actually see it towards the bottom of the spray foam. I go around the whole bottom edge first. All my edges, I fill in that, and then I go back and start doing the other areas. The cool thing about the putty is you can actually use stamps on it. You can use a real rock and wet the rock and just kind of roll the rock on it to give it a more realistic texture to it, although the texture does turn out pretty cool by itself just from putting it on. I try to smooth it so it all runs together but still leave lots of textures in it too, and you can go back and texture you to your heart's content with it. It takes quite a while to dry, so it's not like you're working super fast or anything like that. You can take your time. I usually mix up baseball to a softball size amount to work with. So now I'm going to show you, this is simple, to put some cracks and so some of the texture, I guess, into it. I'll drag a razor blade or a knife or a piece of plastic. It really doesn't matter. Anything that'll help you draw in some cracks in the rocks. I don't do this all the time, but sometimes it is nice to separate and give a little, so it's not one big solid rock throughout the whole thing. You can even mix up little pieces and put on there too and leave a little bit of an edge on them, just to give it a little more, like I said, realistic texture. That's what I'm after. So these ones here, you can't do this kind of detail work with the brush on epoxy. It has to be enough where you can cut into it and it'll stay there. So I just kind of do these first and then let them dry, and then that'll leave that texture there. It's hard, like I said, with the brush on, it just doesn't. It's like a liquid, so it doesn't really keep those textures. I think I'm actually using for my nail gun a little group of nails is what I was using there to draw those in. Anything works though. You can use a fork, a knife, spoon, get creative with it. And you can do this over the entire background if you want to. I want, for tutorial purposes, I was just doing a little bit here, but you can definitely do the whole thing if you want. And this is also a time-consuming part of these enclosures. So when you're doing this, doing little ones gives it a more realistic effect than just one long crack. So the little breaks and pieces in there is really what makes it stand out and look more realistic in the end. So I will go back. Sometimes it pushes up and it looks more like a line drawn in the clay. So I will smooth it out a little bit with a little bit of water. Don't overdo it though, or your crack will be gone and you'll be redoing it again. So making stones, this part is really easy. I'll take and literally make a ball in my hand and then just kind of shape it a little bit. Give a little bit of a rock shape, couple squeezes here, pull there. They don't need to be perfect. That's what makes them better rocks. And then I just stick them on. And once that dries, the epoxy will actually stick to itself and they won't go nowhere. So I found that try to not do them all the same size. Bigger ones, smaller ones, long ones, round ones. Depending on the background, is the style. You might need them a little more sharper or more rounded, that sort of thing. And keep in mind too that you're going to be painting them. So when you're painting them, if they're too close together or hard to get, it's a pain to paint them. So try to keep that in mind a little bit while you're doing it. And you can always just paint when we paint, which I get into a video for. You can paint the whole thing and just paint those rocks right with it. But it looks really cool when you go back and give those little stones like different colors that match the background but aren't the same color. It really makes them stand out and look a lot more realistic to it. This is a great way at the end if you've done all your epoxy putty and you have leftover stuff. I always use it to make stones. It takes hardly any time to do it, and it really adds to any enclosure. It just gives a little bit more uniqueness and realism to it. So don't be afraid to do 10, 20, 50, as many as you want. Remember, you got to paint them, but it really does add a lot more realism to it when you're done. So I like to, sometimes I'll stack them or make piles, like something kind of collapsed. I'll do some little ones, big ones mixed together. Use the little ones to kind of fill in the area and make it look like they've fallen down. You don't want to smash them down onto it. You want it to look like it's a stone sitting on top of the rock or the dirt bottom. So don't mash it or blend it in. You want to, just kind of set it on top, and like I said, they'll stick. They stay on there real well, and you can see I'm just barely setting them down, but they're wet, and the bottom epoxy putty is still wet as well, so they sort of just bond together while they dry. You can see that I'm doing quite a few, and like I said, the more you do, the more realistic it becomes. I try to do them all over in different groups and stuff, not going overboard with it, but if you just add a couple, it's going to look like a couple rocks, and if you do a bunch, it really starts to add to the realism of it. You can smash them to make them look, like I said, more rounded. If you're doing a riverbed style, they'd be smoother stones, for instance. You can smooth them out more. Or if it's a real jagged background, you can make them sharper or jagged, by flattening them out a little bit. And you could honestly do the same thing. You could make bones or little sticks or anything like that you wanted to put into the background as well. This stuff's pretty versatile on how you can use it to make things. So all I'm doing is pretty much just using up the rest of the material I had there. If you want bigger rocks, you can carve them with foam first and then cover them with the epoxy and stick them on the exact same way. That way you don't use quite so much epoxy for it, because it does use up quite a bit. But like I said, it's great at the end when you have a golf ball size left or whatever. You can take and break it up and make some stones. And if you're doing this in a few different batches, which is usually the case, then throughout it you have a little left over every time. You can end up with quite a few little rocks and stuff through your enclosure. The reason you'd want to do, if you were doing like a bigger one, or even these ones, you don't want to do them like right in the background, is because you won't have the sharp edge like it's sitting there. So That's why it's better to, like I said, on a bigger one, carve it in some foam first, even if it's small. Carve it, cover it with the epoxy, and then stick it on, and that way it'll give more realistic effect, like it's sitting on top, like not like it's melted into the bottom stone. And I'm sure this is kind of boring to watch, but I wanted to show the whole process so people could get a better idea how I lay them down, where they go, and how long it actually takes to do it. Sorry for the humming in the background as well. I'm in my shop and it's cold out here, so I have the heaters running. You know, epoxy overall is more expensive than some of the other options out there, but it's so versatile. It's a better material. It's all animal safe from Polygem, and it just lets you do a lot more with it than you can with dry lock or grout or things like that. It's not nearly as messy, even though my hands are dirty with the gloves. It's not nearly as messy as dry lock, or grout is horribly messy, and this dries rock hard, where grout dries like a rock but more like sand. It starts to fall apart real easy. I've actually seen bearded dragons dig right through a 1/4 inch of grout, so I much prefer to use epoxy on everything now. Sometimes too, if you're planning on adding branches or plants or little things in there, you can actually make a rock pile to put it into. It helps kind of hide where you put it into, or when you stick it in the epoxy. So keep in mind, you can get creative with this. You can use it to support things, or build a rock pile to hold something, that sort of thing, real easily. I take and there's acrylic in the bottom of this pond for waterproof, so I wipe out any drips or whatever I get in there so it doesn't stick. Like I said, it's a long process, but you can tell just by looking at this background now how much more realistic it looks, just by adding these little details in. You can also, one thing I do a lot with these is make little holders for air plants. You pretty much just make a rock and put a divot in the middle for the air plant to set in. You can put these throughout your enclosure. There's a lot of air plants that are animal safe, or safe for lizards and stuff. And it's a cool way to add little, some color into your background when you're done. Have a little bit of live plants in there too, real easy to take care of. So I do make quite a bit of holders with this stuff. I also use this too if I'm putting a branch in the enclosure, essentially to attach the branch to the floor or wall or whatever. It works really good for that. Bigger branches, I'll screw them through the side or the back, but on the floor where it's tiled, I can't. So I will build like either a rock pile or even just one rock, just kind of stick it in and blend it into it so it holds it real secure. I'm just doing some final cleanup and touch-ups here and smoothing a couple spots where I got fingerprints or a divot or whatever. Try to watch for things like that. It's real easy to bump it and leave a divot that doesn't look real natural or something with your hands when you're doing these. So even though this is one of the slowest parts, it's one of the most important parts because it just adds the realism to the enclosure. And when you get to the brush on epoxy, you don't really get that luxury. It's kind of more like a painting with syrup, so it doesn't really let you, you're going to be at the mercy of what you carved. So it's nice to add these more 3D realistic details into it before you use the epoxy putty. So That's about it for the putty part of this. Next video I'm going to get into doing the brush on epoxy, which is the messiest part, and it's not hard, but definitely messy.